Thank you very much, Mr. Stewart. I think in the last Westminster Hall debate I took part in, we were limited to 90-second speeches, so it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to expand at some considerable length this afternoon. And I thank the Honourable Member for Sunderland Central and indeed to the proposer, Mr. Frost, for bringing forward this petition for debate on behalf of the 250,000 signatories, nearly 500 of whom come from my North West Norfolk constituency, and the petitioners have called on the government to increase the income tax personal allowance to £20,000 to help low earners and pensioners. There's probably a bit of a spoiler alert here. I think they're going to be disappointed because we've all seen the government's response where it says there are no such plans. I think it's worth noting that over the last 60 years, no Labour government has left office with the tax burden lower than when it started, a similar position to on unemployment, where it's always left unemployment higher than it inherited. And indeed, the tax burden as a percentage of GDP is forecast to hit its highest level since the Second World War during the end of this Parliament. And the cause of this pattern is philosophical, a belief that there is such a thing as government money, when there is only taxpayers' money, and we Conservatives want people to keep more of it. As the Shadow Chancellor has said, we must drive taxes lower and do so in a responsible manner. Others have referred to the House of Commons library research, which estimates a cost between 50 to 65 billion, depending on the choices that are made on other parts of the allowance, to raise the personal allowance, as the petition calls to everyone, for £20,000. That's about what we spend on the defence budget. So to introduce such a policy, people have to be very clear about the choices that they are proposing, the spending that they would cut, or the increases in other taxes that they would make, or indeed if they would fund this through borrowing. And anyone promising such an increase has to be honest about that and set out very clearly their choices openly. And we as a party will be doing that before the next general election. And it was under the last Conservative government that we, of course, increased the personal allowance significantly to benefit low earners and made that a priority. It increased by 40% in real terms from 2010, from £6,475 to the £12,570 it is today, a change that has benefited millions of UK taxpayers. Of course, I also acknowledge that the last government had to take the difficult decision to freeze that threshold until 2028. That was very unwelcome, unpopular. I don't think it won us any votes. But that decision followed the hundreds of billions of pounds that we put in place to protect lives and livelihoods during the COVID pandemic. Indeed, other parties were calling on us to spend even more, as I recall. And that was support that supported the poorest people the most. And then there was billions more spent in response to the energy price shock. Money, again, that needs to be paid back. However, it's also the case that if the personal allowance has simply been uprated by inflation every year since 2010, it would have only been around £9,650 in 23-24, lower than the current level it has reached. And at the last election, it was Labour who promised not to raise taxes on working people, a promise which they obviously broke in the October budget with the increases in national insurance. And that was justified on the grounds of restoring financial responsibility and economic stability. Again, that's referred to in response to the petition. But it's hard to see that stability. The government's actions have led to a collapse in business confidence, to see taxes and borrowing rise incredibly at record levels, and growth that was meant to be the overriding priority has flatlined. And whilst last week's cut in interest rates was welcome, it's also the case that Labour's policies are expected to mean that their interest rates stay higher for longer than they would have done under the plans that we had. And only last week, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research pointed out that they assessed the Chancellor would miss her fiscal rules by £63 billion by the end of the forecast period. And of course, that came after the emergency budget only a few weeks ago, which saw rushed cuts to welfare budgets, which I know colleagues across the House are concerned are untargeted. And that was simply to spare the Chancellor the blushes of missing her own fiscal rules. And as a result of the government's actions, questions are being asked about the levels of personal taxation, and particularly the personal allowance, the subject of this position, which they pledged to unfreeze in 2020. Indeed, the Chancellor made much of this at the autumn budget, saying, and I quote, "From 2028 to 29, personal tax thresholds will be uprated in line with inflation once again. When it comes to choices on tax, this government chose to protect working people every single time. I think the second part of that sentence we might disagree about, but the statement was clear and unambiguous about the policy, and it maintained the position that the last Conservative government had to lift that freeze in 2028. But there has been recent reports in the media that this is issues that the Treasury are looking at as they look at trying to keep in the headroom, again, the too limited headroom that the Chancellor's got in place. So will the Minister today give an unambiguous commitment and restate that pledge to unfreeze the personal allowance from 2028? It doesn't obviously go anywhere near as far as the petitioners would want, but at least it would be something. And I want to turn now to pensioners, where the petition refers particularly to the position of pensioners, and the member introducing the petition referred to that. And millions of people in receipt of only the state pension now face paying income tax on it. Of course, many with modest private provision already face that situation. Forecasts suggest an estimated 9 million pensioners will pay income tax on their state pension from April 2026. At the general election, we had a very clear policy, the triple lock plus commitment, that would ensure that people who relied on the state pension as their only source of income would never pay income tax on it. Labour refused to match our policy at that time. In government, they've maintained opposition to it. And the Minister has, despite several parliamentary questions I've tabled to him, been reluctant to give the Treasury estimates of the number of pensioners that he expects to be paying income tax who only receive the state pension and when they'll do so. So perhaps he will today come clean with the figures that the government must have about how many pensioners are going to have to pay income tax when all they have in income is the state pension. I assume the Minister is aware of those figures and assessed their impact when they were deciding to cut the winter fuel payments, again, from very vulnerable people. In the last Parliament, I supported measures by the then government to cut taxes for working people towards the end of the Parliament, with reductions in employee national insurance, the last of which last March was worth £10 billion. We believe in people keeping more of their own money, and the Minister should today give the signatories of this petition clear answers to the following questions. Will the government stick to its promise to increase the personal allowance from 2028? And is the government committed to not raising the rates of income tax, VAT in this Parliament, and will he rule out any further increases in national insurance rates? I look forward to the Minister's response.